you went to IIT Kharagpur for computer science and you had a job in software engineering. And where does this come? How does computer science engineer get into, you know what, I care about
Right.
this? What is the story behind that?
We learned that a single event of displacement can essentially set back families by decades, by like 18 to 20 years. So the minute you lose the roof over your head and you're forced to move, people tend to lose their jobs. Children have to be pulled out of school. There is significantly higher instances of health hazards, of diseases, of infection. And so for us, Nostos wasn't to provide a better tent. It wasn't to provide a better shelter. The idea was, can we give people a mechanism that they can make their own and that they can use to rebuild their lives, that they can use to regain a sense of security, a sense of safety, a sense of dignity. But when we got the houses there and we tried to build them out, a lot of them just did not work. And that was surprising for us. We were like, okay, now what do we do? We had multiple issues at this point, right? One was, okay, we need to fix these houses and make sure that they can actually be deployed. Second was, we have to figure out what went wrong. Is this on us? Did we design it poorly? When there is a disaster, when there is displacement, we can't expect that at the site of deployment we will have a lot of resources. We can't expect that we'll have even access to electricity. So going from idea to first house on the ground was, I think, like this big stretch, massive growth journey where everybody across the team was really stretched, everybody across the team expanded their skill set and learned a lot. But I'm really glad that we sort of got there and learned what we did.
86.5 million people get displaced every year, either because of a natural calamity or a war. We all read about news and information like this every year, but then how many of us are actually taking an action? Today, I am meeting with Madhav Datt, who is the co-founder of Nostos Homes. Nostos is building prefab homes to help those who are displaced get some shelter and ultimately build a community around it. I'm incredibly excited to figure out how Madhav and his team have gone ahead and basically built these houses, thought of whether it should be a profit, non-profit venture, what are the kind of materials to be used, how do you actually get something from a sketch to a built house and deploy it in the areas of need. So stay tuned and follow along as we explore in today's episode of Building It Big's Nostos Homes. Hey Madhav, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you. All right, so I want to just jump straight into this. What is Nostos Homes in your words? I've seen the website, I've read a little bit, but how do you describe this?
Right. So Nostos is, we're building homes for people who are forcibly displaced. And the way that we went about this was that we took a very sort of design and tech forward approach to building these houses. So each home is basically a flat pack. It can be collapsed down, loaded into trucks, shipped off to disaster sites, and then built out almost like Lego. And the reason that we cared so much about being able to like build these out super easily, where we did not want, specialized tools or training or like access to electricity, we didn't assume any of those things would be available because we wanted this to be able to reach like the hardest to reach. We wanted to be able to deploy these in some very remote parts of the world. And so we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that that was truly possible. And I think that that's a big part of what defines Nostos. I can talk more about, why we did this, but ultimately for us, this is a mechanism to help displaced people, sort of take control, rebuild their lives, and kind of gain a sense of security, dignity, and a sense of self again.
Yeah, I love the mission, and I definitely want to dive further into how you came up with the design and everything. But precursor to that, I'm also interested, you went to IIT Kharagpur for computer science and you had a job in software engineering. And where does this come? How does, a computer science engineer get into, you know what, I care about this? What is the story behind that? You want to unpack that for me a bit?
So I think we go way back.
Sure.
I was many years ago as a kid, I started something that eventually became a nonprofit called Green the Gene. And the idea behind that nonprofit was helping communities in climate crisis get access to early tech solutions. right? So it was based on this realization that there are people out there who are living in very difficult circumstances where the systematic solution, like the policy solution, or the long-term solution, are going to take decades, right? So, for instance, I'll give you an example. We worked with communities in Tanzania who did not have access to safe water. And for them to actually get safe water the proper way, you'd have to, build a lot of infrastructure, you'd have to pass policy and so on. And that's like multiple decades away, but they still need water today, right?
Yeah.
They don't have access to safe water today. And so they're still walking around with jerry cans. They're still trying to sort of make do with sketchy sources of water and so on. So they're not in a great situation. And so our mission there was that, can we help these communities through tech interventions they're not going to solve the systemic problem. There are band-aids.
Yeah.
And so I had been working on this for many years. But in this process, I met Kaushal, my co-founder for Nostos. We were in college together. He lived a few doors down from me in IIT Kharagpur. And he had experienced forcible displacement growing up. And so that was a big incentive for him. He studied architecture. And his design project, his thesis, was primarily focused on resilient housing and disaster shelters. So one fine day I walked into his room and he had, like this whole sheet with a lot of drawings and things like that and some models basically all over his room. And I was like, this looks really interesting. We can probably actually build this, right? This doesn't have to be an academic thing only. We can put this on the ground. And so that's where we started talking, and we kind of decided that, okay, we're gonna start this. We're gonna explore this as an idea, and we'll see if it has legs, right?
Yeah.
Very early on, before we had even built anything, we kind of submitted this through one of the channels to the World Bank, and it got a lot of traction there. So both of us, we went to DC. We got an opportunity to present at the World Bank. We talked about why this makes sense, why this works, both from like a unit economics, a business perspective, but also because just the product itself and why current solutions just don't cut it. And because of the traction that we got there, we realized that, okay, this is something really cool. This is something that we can actually do. And so we went full-fledged into that. So I think my CS degree per se didn't really help, but Kaushal's architecture one did for sure. And we brought together a lot of different pieces of innovation, different sorts of ideas into what is now the final Nostos home that we see around and deployed in a lot of places.
Right. I mean, even when you say your CS degree didn't quite come to help, but I think what engineering really teaches you is systemic thinking, right? And this is kind of putting components together in a bare minimum way, if you were to say it that way, right?
Definitely. I think the idea of or this belief that, hey, we can take an idea and we can actually build it out, that definitely comes from multiple reps in the engineering degree and multiple reps in like just building other things in general. And so I think that played a pretty big role.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so you mentioned now you went to DC, pitched, and then you did all of this like computations, like this makes sense from a unit economics perspective and all of that. What was the thinking behind at that point of time? Like, where were you seeing? Well, Nostos wasn't really a brand then, but then where were you seeing to take this, and like what was the goal or what was the vision from your perspective?
Yeah. So I think before we went to and presented in DC, one of the big things that we did was we really wanted to kind of really understand how displacement works, right? And what happens. A lot of it is somewhat intuitive and somewhat obvious, but a lot of it is incredibly surprising, unexpected, and significantly worse than I would have imagined. Right. So we did a lot of exploration around this. We talked to refugees in Zatari, in the camps in Jordan. We talked to refugees, climate refugees. We talked to refugees of violent conflict, and across the board, multiple displaced people in multiple contexts. And we learned that a single event of displacement can essentially set back families by decades, by like 18 to 20 years. And when that happens, it's not about the roof over your head. Sure, that's very important, but that's not the primary thing. It has a ripple effect, right? So the minute you lose the roof over your head and you're forced to move, people tend to lose their jobs. Children have to be pulled out of school. There is significantly higher instances of health hazards, of diseases, of infection And this was around COVID. So these camps were essentially hotbeds of like spread, because there's no way that you
Yeah.
can have social distancing. Typically, there's no real access to consistent hygiene. You don't have access to clean running water. Energy access is not a thing. You have some limited electricity and so on. So there is a very stark decline in what is possible as a person, right? So now you're going from this functioning, established family as part of an established community into you've suddenly been thrown out, and now you don't have a job, you don't have access to a job, you kids can't go to school anymore, food is becoming harder to get, you're much more exposed to diseases, safety and security, like actual physical safety becomes a big issue. A lot of these cases, these homes or tents aren't really lockable. Whatever belongings you could salvage, now you have to sort of make sure you can actually hold on to them. Fire hazards are very real in large camps. So it has this massive ripple effect that can really take a toll on people and their ability to sort of rebuild their lives. And so for us, Nostos was the idea wasn't to be like it wasn't to provide a better tent, it wasn't to provide a better shelter. The idea was, can we give people a mechanism that they can make their own and that they can use to rebuild their lives, that they can use to regain a sense of security, a sense of safety, a sense of dignity. Um, and so that is the direction with which we went in. And so a big part of this was it has to look and feel like a home, right? It has to have this sense of permanence. It has to have um, basic things like lockability, but also it has to have some mechanism for people to express themselves, and it has to be customizable, and it has to actually suit their needs. So there was a lot of different elements that we brought together, that we identified that these things are really important, these things matter, and which is why we're going to prioritize these, and which is why in the design process, um, the vision became that we're going to build a house that can actually become a home in a time of crisis. Um, that's where we started. Things pivoted a lot over time. Obviously, things evolved.
Yeah.
The materials that we were thinking of changed a lot.
Yeah.
The approach that we took early on changed a lot. The way we approach manufacturing. So almost everything is different now than it was from what the original design that we presented at the World Bank. But the vision, the idea, and why we're doing it remain very consistent.
That is amazing. Okay, so you mentioned that you spoke to a bunch of refugees, and from there, you of course got a lot of ground data in terms of like, oh, it's not just a displacement of a home, but it's a displacement of a community at that point of time,
Yeah.
right? So, how did you get access to, like, say, speaking to people who've gone through this? And secondly, like, what were the things which you were trying to like particularly tap into when you like speak to somebody who's gone through this?
Yeah. I think the access was interesting. In some cases, it was by, so I've done some work with the UN in the past. In some cases, it was just leaning into some of those networks. In some cases, it was just literally walking into one of these camps and actually just talking to people. Um, I think there is a very major sort of trend that displacement aid is limited to moving people into camps, and there isn't much effort that's put in afterwards. So people were very happy to talk to us. They were very happy to share their stories, tell us about what happened, what changed, reminisce about life before, talk about what is going on now, how do they see themselves getting back to some semblance of normality. And we learned so much in that process. We went in with some questions, but ultimately we learned the most by just listening to their stories, by just understanding where they were coming from, what they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and what truly mattered to them. That was, I think, really eye-opening, and helped us kind of frame what Nostos could be and what Nostos should be.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so then moving to, okay, you've got an idea, you've got a concept, which is say on these drafted sheets and papers, you've of course gotten the access to like people that you can speak to, just kind of like validate how big of a problem, what exactly happens on the ground, all of that stuff, right? You go present in World Bank, get some traction. I'm guessing at this point is where you get funded through World Bank or the UN, or is there a different
Uh,
channel that you, yeah.
so we got funded through so Goldman Sachs runs an analyst impact fund
Hmm.
competition,
Yeah.
and so we had somebody who's an analyst at the time at Goldman present pitch us, And I think that was our first money in for Nostos. And overall, we've continued to sort of retain and build that relation with Goldman. We've gotten resources from Mastercard. We've gotten resources from Mishcon de Rea, which is a law firm based in the UK, has been super generous, and we've been a part of their employee giving programs, as have construction organizations like Coins, etc. So I think it has been a big sort of coming together of many different
Yeah.
corporations, many different organizations from around the world in terms of resources.
Yeah.
And I think we've kind of, in various forms, relayed that into the homes that have been built.
Yeah. Okay. So that brings me to the next point then. So you've got like a bunch of organizations who all share the common belief that, okay, we need to make sure that this community gets back to their livelihoods and everything, right?
Yeah.
Now, how do you go on from here, right? So you, of course, have a computer science background. Your co-founder has an architectural background, but you still need to like actually build this thing, right? So talk to me about like, okay, what's the day 0, day 30, and like how does that life cycle
Yeah.
look like? Yeah.
It was hard. So when early on we had traction, now we had cash in the bank, and Kaushal and I, my co-founder and I, we were sitting together and we're like, okay, how do we build these houses? Right?
Yeah.
We've never manufactured a thing in our lives before. We don't really know what construction looks like, right? He has some exposure through architecture, I have some exposure to manufacturing, but that's like tech hardware. And it's not, this is very different, right? The volumes of material that have to be moved are very different. So there were a lot of questions that we had to deal with. One was, philosophically, how do we want to manufacture this, right? Do we want this to be local in areas where there's displacement? Do we want this to be manufactured in a central location and use some of the efficiencies that come out of that? How does that affect the economics of this nonprofit? How does that affect how quickly we can deliver impact on the ground? And so there were multiple questions that all hinged on manufacturing. So what we did was that we were like, okay, we're going to do one single unit as a pilot, as a test. We brought on board somebody with a manufacturing background onto our team, and we started to sort of expand beyond just ourselves. At this point, I think we grew the team to about 8 to 9 people, and across a very wide range of backgrounds.
Sure.
These were all volunteers, so entirely through the lifetime of Nostos, we've all been volunteers. Nobody's drawn payroll, and I think that's also been very important because that allows us to put 100% of our resources to delivering impact. And I think that that's a big differentiator for the way that we functioned. Eventually, our first kind of attempt was to find a contract manufacturer and give them very specific designs and specs and all that, and then go through this detailed vendor acceptance test to make sure that they're meeting quality guidelines that we had. But eventually kind of using their manufacturing facilities and resources and skill set to actually build this up. We talked to a lot of people, and the price point did not make sense for us. Right? Like we were getting quotes that were insanely expensive. That were like 4x, 5x, 7x the price point that we had in our mind. So it took a lot of tweaking in terms of the design. It took a lot of simplifications in terms of what we could do and how the house was being built and so on, so that the total cost, like on ground cost, could still fit within what we wanted. Because ultimately we were very price sensitive here, right? Every dollar that we save means that more people are getting shelter. And so we cared pretty deeply about that. And in this process, we eventually signed a manufacturer. We kind of built out the first home with them. They did a whole test. At this time, COVID was absolutely raging around the world. So there was a lot of lockdowns. We weren't able to visit their site in person. And that meant that we were doing this over like video calls and over Zoom. And that made it really hard because we couldn't have our team on the ground, like actually evaluating the houses. But we to some extent made that work, and they built it out for us as a demonstration, and we were happy with that. They shipped out some of the houses to a location that we identified in rural Karnataka, around like the southern coast of India, and this was sort of a full loop moment also, because Kaushal grew up in that part of the world and experienced forcible displacement there, and so communities there had this annual cycle of flooding. But when we got the houses there and we tried to build them out, a lot of them just did not work. And that was surprising for us. We were like, okay, now what do we do, right? So we had multiple kind of issues at this point, right? One was, okay, we need to fix these houses and make sure that they can actually be deployed. Second was we have to figure out what went wrong, right? So we have to do some sort of postmortem here. Is this on us? Did we design it poorly? Is this a manufacturing problem? Is this a shipping problem? Are these houses just not, shippable across these distances in the way that we expected them to be, right? So we had a lot of these questions around why are these not working, right? Early on. So one house we were able to build relatively, I don't want to say easily, because it was a lot of pain, and like we had to apply much more force than was expected and so on. So I mean, the designed deployment versus the actual deployment were pretty different. But in this process, we figured out that the level of precision that we expected in terms of manufacturing was not the level of precision that we got. And this led to a dispute with the manufacturer. This was like, we spent a lot of time going back and forth with them in terms of how to fix that problem. And so that escalated quite a bit, and we had to spend a lot of time kind of dealing with that vendor relationship. But also then we had to rethink what is possible in terms of design, right? And if we really do need that level of precision manufacturing, we might have to make some trade-offs on cost. We might have to make some trade-offs in terms of centralization. And so that was a little bit of a soul-searching moment. We spent a lot of time thinking through those trade-offs, and eventually we decided that yes, we do want precision manufacturing. We do care that things just have to fit in the moment, because when there is a disaster, when there is displacement, we can't expect that at the site of deployment we will have a lot of resources. We can't expect that we'll have even access to electricity, right? And because of that, we were like, we will preempt that. We will put in all the work in advance, and we'll pay a little extra in terms of precision manufacturing. We will pay a lot extra in terms of moving things around the world, because we could only do this in very specific locations with very specific know-how. But all that said, we decided that, okay, now at this stage, we're comfortable with the quality of manufacturing, just so that at the site, everything can come together like Lego. It can be built without any like tools, training. It just works. And so that was a big trade-off that we made. And all of this, throughout this, there was a lot of learning that happened. So going from idea to first house on the ground was, I think, like this big stretch, massive growth journey where everybody across the team was really stretched. Everybody across the team expanded their skill set and learned a lot. But I'm really glad that we sort of got there and learned what we did.
Yeah. No, definitely sounds something you should be proud of, and like the team should be proud of. So I have so many questions with all the things that you just said, right? So firstly, like just talking about the unit, right? Like say the house itself. What all does it come with? Because you mentioned also the notion of utilities, which is there's water, there's electricity. So is it fair to assume like this one residential house is going to have all the utilities connection, or like how do you manage that? So why don't you start with that, and I'll pop other questions then.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we focused a lot on customization, right? On flexibility. So the houses can come, basically the default house is a bare bones structure. It is very robust, very easy to build, but it doesn't contain anything inside. And then the next sort of thing that we can add to that is we can split that into two houses. We can split that into multiple rooms. We can add various kinds of dividers to kind of lean in on the modularity of the design and make some sort of customization possible. There is a separate bathroom unit that can be included if people want, but in a lot of cases we learned that people prefer not to have their bathrooms attached with the houses for various cultural reasons, and so we kept that as a separate module, a separate unit. It's very easy for us to add on solar panels on top, and that can provide everything. You can scale it up and down. So for instance, in certain situations, the maximum that was necessary or useful was just the ability to charge a mobile phone. In some cases, what was helpful was to have a full-fledged connection with the grid, right? In some cases, more like a self-contained, one light, one phone charger kind of a situation. So there's a lot of range in terms of what we can provide and what sort of connections are possible. And so we leave that very open-ended, very flexible, because we realize that displacement is definitely not a one-size-fits-all problem,
Yeah.
um, where different countries, different geographies, and different disasters have very different response mechanisms, and we wanted to make sure that we're truly adapting to those response mechanisms.
And who makes this decision? Like, say, I mean, you have this gamut of services or like modules that you could attach or detach, right? Um, like, who is the decision maker here? Because, I mean, to the displays, they of course are looking for their home, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Typically, so the way we operate is that we partner with an on-ground entity in the displaced area.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in Malawi, which was one of our recent flagship projects, we worked with Habitat for Humanity as well as with the national government. And so we had a lot of inputs from both these organizations in terms of identifying beneficiaries, like who are the people in the most need at this point, who could sort of gain the maximum value out of these houses, where do you want to deploy them, land access, all of that, but also in what are the right decisions in a situation like this, right? What will be most helpful, what will truly move the needle versus what will be superfluous. And there we realized that bathrooms are not necessarily helpful, right? They already have reasonable access to like sort of joint common bathroom facilities, and what is most helpful are going to be the houses. So it takes us non-trivial amounts of space to ship a bathroom, and so for us, we were like, we're going to use that space for houses instead. And that was trade-offs like this can make a pretty big difference in terms of what reaches the ground, what actually gets used. And so we lean very heavily on our partners, particularly on Habitat for Humanity in Malawi, to make some of these decisions. It's usually a joint process. It's very collaborative. We try and learn from ultimately experts on the ground in terms of what makes sense, what will be most useful, and then kind of follow through on that.
Got it. Got it. So, like, there's of course this notion of a prefab home, right? How is a prefab home different from what Nostos builds?
I think one way to think of it is that Nostos is to some extent a prefab home, right? The process ultimately is very similar. Like the pieces, the components are fabricated beforehand, they're shipped and they're built. The big differences are in terms of the trade-offs that we've made. So, for instance, we've cared very, very heavily about building these without tools, without training, like with simple hammers and like screwdrivers and all that, but you don't need power tools. And so some of those trade-offs have probably been very important for us, much more so than traditional prefab homes, which are built in areas which do have access to like infrastructure. So I think that was a pretty big difference. And the other was around materials used. So we care that these are robust, they can last for a long time, but also that they can be disassembled and packed back into flat packs, right? We don't want a situation where we deployed these homes, now the people have stayed in them for a few years, but now they're moving back to their permanent houses and these are just sitting there empty, right? So we have a 30-year lifespan on each house, and typically the way that a lot of governmental agencies have interacted with them is that they've decided they're going to hold them as inventory. If there's a disaster, they're going to take these houses, deploy them at the site, build them out, have people stay in them till people can move back typically into their own permanent houses. And when they do, they sort of decommission, disassemble these houses, put them back into flat packs, and then store them again till the next disasters and then reuse them. So this means that these houses can continually get use, and we can make sure there are people living in them basically at all times without kind of locking them down to a location or making people live in them after it is necessary.
Yeah, that's an important point which I wanted to touch on. Thanks for bringing that up. So, I mean, you spoke about like displaced communities and like say bringing people back in terms of like where they were, right? Or maybe better, right? So I think the question that I have is like, what exactly do you see in terms of like say a lifespan of a Nostos home? Like first you mentioned like it can withstand a 30-year period, but essentially like how do you leverage that, okay, somebody who's displaced or a community that is displaced, okay, we've now provided you the shelter, but like parallelly you can go build this, right? Like is there a bridge that connects that path? Or you go like, okay, fine, we've given you a shelter, and like there's somebody else who's coming and like say helping on building the main thing again?
It depends. It varies.
Sure.
But typically, we focus very heavily on this post-disaster recovery and rebuilding period. So we don't
Right.
place ourselves in the permanent home building
Yeah.
area at all. And organizations like Habitat do a great job of that. They are experts in building with like brick and mortar and like traditional house building materials. And so that's an area where we're happy to provide support, but that's not what we focus on. Our
Sure.
focus typically is on that post-disaster period where you need houses built quickly, where you want people to have a home as soon as possible, just to give them a mechanism to recover. Now, the problem though is that typically these intermediate term shelters are used for many years, right? And if we don't do stuff like this with Nostos, typically people are in tents for many years. Because that rebuilding cycle of rebuilding their homes, restoring the land around it, getting to a state where people can move back is a multi-year cycle. And if there are governments, it very heavily depends on how equipped those governments are to deal with such situations. It very heavily depends on local response. It depends on infrastructure in place and so on. So because of all of these elements, the intermediate term becomes really important. But that said, our hope and the purpose with which we built these houses is that people can move out of them eventually and move back into what is their own locations, their own land, and eventually what is a fully permanent home for themselves. Though that said, you did mention a very interesting point around communities, and another thing that we've learned in this process is that it's never people or individuals that are displaced, it is communities, right?
Yeah.
Which also means that when people move into Nostos homes, we think of them as moving into a full-fledged Nostos community, where people can sort of retain some of the social structures that were around them. They don't have to be dispersed across like multiple tens of kilometers of refugee camp space. They can actually kind of rebuild some of that same social structure within these communities and lean on each other for support, use some of the same social networks that they had before. And as they kind of transition out of these homes and move back into more permanent shelters, those social support structures travel with them.
Got it. So you spoke about material when you were mentioning about like the two homes, right? How do you select material? What is the material? And also, like when we're talking about displacement, right? I think it could be either man-made or natural causes. Man-made, let's just put that aside for a second, but like natural causes, I mean, a location topographically often has that tendency, right? Like say if there's a flood, it might happen again. If there's like a landslide, it might happen again, right? How do you make that choice?
Great question. So I think a big thing that we've done in terms of material and in terms of the design is iteration. We've gone over it many, many times. We've tried multiple things and we've made some trade-offs. One of the big ones was that we want the house to be light but sturdy, right? So these are opposing values that we've held. We care a lot about the house being insulated because you don't want people to be freezing. You don't want people to be boiling. And so we want material that can provide for such insulation, even though, for instance, we could use steel sheets and aluminum sheets. It would basically convert the house into an oven. So we did not want that, right? And so we've made a lot of these trade-offs, and some of these trade-offs have come in terms of like, okay, that means that it's going to be harder to pack, or that it's going to be harder to deploy, or that it's going to cost more, and things like that. So ultimately what we've landed on is a frame that uses mild steel, which makes it very solid, very robust. It is possible to anchor that mild steel into the ground, but it's not necessary. Which means that you have this choice depending on, for instance, if it's a cyclone-prone area, then it's worthwhile to anchor them to the ground, and then you've got a house that can withstand like 170 kilometers an hour of wind speed. And so that's fine because, as you mentioned, places that have cyclones tend to have cyclones often. And so these houses are then equipped to sort of weather that climate. They're equipped to stand and like survive those situations really well. Versus in some places where, for instance, there's flooding, we have an option to increase some of the length of the frame, and so that the houses can be lifted above the ground. So they're sort of on stilts, which means that even if water floods up to a level, people living inside would be unaffected, right? So a lot of these design choices are made in context of the displacement, in context of the locations where we're building these houses. But another sort of element for lightness that we made, both for lightness and insulation, was we used puff panels. So we used kind of synthetic materials sandwiched between sheet metal, to build some of the walls, right? And for roofing, we used aluminum, but also we added in like layers of insulation under it. So there have been a lot of these kind of experimental, iterative design choices over time that we figured out, okay, this works well. This broke on the way to shipping, so this can't actually be deployed, and so on. And then a lot of this is pretty cutting edge. We've been able to file multiple patents on the design of the house and on the way that it is built. And I think that innovation has also been a pretty big part of our culture. So we still keep trying. We still keep exploring new materials. We still keep trying to see if there's ways in which we can make the house lighter, easier to assemble, easier to ship. And it's an ongoing process for us.
Yeah, no, of course. So speaking about like the just build process, right? I'm guessing there's just like some base material which you always need, right? But how fast can, say, the most basic house be deployed, assembled, and somebody can start living in it?
So removing the logistics of shipping a house to a disaster
Sure.
site, house can be built in about 6 hours by 6 people without any specialized tools or training. So these are just 6 people who are following sort of a step-by-step guidebook that has pictures around how you attach to components and things like that, but it doesn't
Right.
require any tools, it doesn't require any prior training. So within 6 hours, you can have that house on the ground. Typically, we ask the family that's going to live in the houses to be a part of the construction process, because I think that helps them, one, feel a much greater sense of ownership, be much more involved, and then that way they can make sure that they're actually getting something that's meaningful and useful to them. So in a disaster site, if there are multiple families that are in that community, we essentially would bring a truck. Each family would get a flat pack of a home, and then they can follow the instructions and have the entire community built up, usually by the end of the day.
And I mean, again, a lot of these areas are often pretty rural, which means literacy could be a challenge and whatnot, right? How do you tackle those things? Because English may not be a language or like any of those things, right? Like, so what's the ground reality of like, okay, here's the guidebook, which is extremely visual and whatnot, right?
Yeah, definitely. So we realized that pretty quickly, particularly, for instance, the work that we did in Malawi. We realized that one, people don't typically speak English, but second, literacy rates are limited. We can't expect any access to the internet, so we can't use like videos and things like that. So it ultimately became a printed book that goes with each home, which has details on how things attach, right? Or what's step 1, what's step 2, and so on. It's this assembly guide, highly visual, using a lot of photos, using a lot of like graphics and illustrations around how things fit together. And so far, we've seen that work well, but we are trying to figure out ways to augment that further, maybe potentially through sending like a preloaded tablet, like a preloaded Android tablet with like video content around some of the trickier pieces and so on. There's also a skill building component, right? So there's capacity building in the sense that the first time this happens, it's harder to build houses. You're still learning. But after that, once somebody in that community has an understanding of how these work, it's very easy for them to take charge and like teach other people. So once that skill set exists in the community, we've seen significantly higher success rates. We've seen significantly higher involvement. They typically tend to take like a leadership role within that group, and sort of propagate that skill forward.
Interesting. So in terms of then talking about location, right? So you mentioned, of course, Africa and India are the 2 places where you've deployed currently. Okay. Just like talking from a numbers point of view, right? How many Nostos homes are there right now which you have shipped? Secondly, why the locations wherever they are, right?
Yeah. So a better way to think about Nostos and impact is not number of homes, but number of nights of shelter served. And the reason that we care about that much more is that in a lot of cases, these homes can be held as inventory, which means they're not being used, but they exist and they're part of a disaster preparedness framework for either the government or for local nonprofits. And so we've done about 500,000 nights of shelter so far across both India and Malawi. And the reason that we picked these two places was based on multiple factors. One was, could we get support from a governmental agency? That is very important to us because there's a lot in terms of reaching these locations, right, which needs support from official frameworks. And also if there's import of material involved, we want to make sure that everything can happen smoothly. We want to make sure that the government is actively on board and is kind of championing some of these efforts. That also helps in terms of like access to the locations, access to land on which these houses will be built. Typically that land is either government owned or government controlled. And so we start by asking ourselves, can we build a good partnership with a formal source of authority in these areas? The second thing that we ask is, can we get a good local partner, a nonprofit or an aid agency, a relief group, somebody on the ground who understands the space well enough and has the capacity to support a deployment, has the capacity to make sure that these houses, once they reach, they can be kept securely, they can be built out, can support the process, can support shipping, logistics, all of that. Once we have these two, we start having some conversations. Like we've sort of realized that our capacity to deliver impact is far, far, far lower than the need for such houses. And so, which means that we do have to kind of pick and have to limit ourselves to certain geographies. We've decided that we're going to go deep in some of these areas instead of spreading ourselves too thin. And because once the first time setting up these supply chains is really, really hard. So we want to kind of double down and triple down once we have those supply chains in place and kind of continue to leverage the relations, leverage the supply chain, and make sure that we continue deploying more houses in those areas instead of trying to rebuild new supply chains to different countries.
Right.
So these factors play a pretty big role. We also care very deeply about the kind of institutional voids that we're filling. We care very deeply about whether these houses will land almost in the sense that will people want to use them? Are we equipped to serve the needs of that particular disaster? Are we equipped to serve the needs of that particular displacement event? And if all of these factors come together, they're true, then we kind of start to develop those partnerships, get into negotiations. A lot of this is just making sure that all the stakeholders are truly aligned and, are agreeing on what the vision for this is, but also that we can bring in the funds needed to actually support this deployment.
Got it. And just in terms of, like, say, this whole value chain that you have to follow through, right? For a new location, are the keys, like, say, with you, as in, like, with Nostos, or do you guys, like, just basically depend on, like, Habitat, wherever they are going, so you'd go along? Like, who makes that decision primarily?
So we've only partnered with Habitat so far in Malawi. And we work with different organizations in different locations. Typically, we are very flexible in terms of who we partner with, what scale we partner with them at. Habitat was a very global organization. They have very strong national presence in Malawi versus, for instance, in Assam, we worked with a more localized nonprofit, which had very, very deep experience and expertise with those communities. And so our approach varies a lot in terms of what makes sense, in terms of what is possible and what's available. But typically, the decision to expand to a new geography is up to us and dependent on the factors that we talked about around, like, capacity, partnerships, and funding.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Now, speaking a little bit about the non-profit element of this, right? Like, so you made a conscious choice of, like, this needs to be a non-profit. So I really have two questions for you there, right? The first one's kind of easy. I can intuitively say why I understand, like, why this has to be a non-profit, which is, say, fine. The more complicated one is like, okay, you've made that choice for all the right reasons, but now what are the hard lessons coming out of this, right? Because it is not easy to say even raise funds for it, right? I mean, you spoke about, like, the prices going 4x, 5x in terms of, like, what you had predicted. And I can only imagine how hard it must have been to convince, like, oh, this landing is going to happen at like $10 instead of like $1 for a component or whatever, right? So talk
Yeah.
to me a little bit about that part of the journey as well.
Yeah, definitely. Nonprofits are hard. And non-profit startups are harder because now you have the problems of a nonprofit and you have the problems of a startup,
Yeah.
right? So one of the big challenges that we had was that we had no equity to sell, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of traditional fundraising mechanisms simply disappear, and we were pretty heavily or entirely dependent on philanthropy. Um, Another element of that was that we couldn't charge people living in these houses. We were working with communities where people are earning less than $1 a day, and so that it was very unreasonable for us, especially after they've lost employment and access to their livelihoods, for us to go in and be like, hey, you have to pay us for these houses.
Yeah.
So that was something that we took off the table very quickly. We still explored whether we can build a commercially viable business around this by charging, for instance, governmental agencies or like aid agencies or nonprofits that are in this area, and that still did not really make sense because the economics of that did not work out. In terms of governments, the willingness to pay was really not there. We were working in countries with limited resources and resources that were already stretched very thin in times of disaster. And so for us, we landed on the philanthropic model. That was a tough decision, but we were like, this is realistically, given the circumstances, the only thing that truly makes sense and aligns with the values of what we want to do and aligns with the mission that we have here, right? So we could, ultimately, it was always an option for us to be like, okay, instead of building houses for like displaced people in very hard to reach geographies, we could always sort of build these houses in like Coachella or Burning Man or something. There's a market for that. There's a very strong commercial market for that. But our idea was that we're very mission driven. We care. The nonprofit was started with a purpose in mind, and that's what we're going to stick to, right? And so philanthropic donations was realistically the only way to fundraise. That was hard. That means that, and usually both of us as co-founders, but that basically meant that we're fundraising all the time, right? Our ability to deliver impact is limited by our ability to fundraise. So we're in the situation where there are like hundreds of inbound requests to deploy houses, and we have to kind of just blanket decline all of them, despite them being very real issues that we could address, just because we don't have the resources to expand into those areas, or whatever resources we have are already committed. So that makes it really hard in terms of impact. The second is that we also made a very conscious active decision that we're going to be run entirely by volunteers and not by paid staff. This involved some very real trade-offs, because if you have paid staff, you've got people full-time, committed, dedicated to running this. But we learned a few things. One was that given our resources and where we were at, we could not afford to pay people too much, right? And so by going the volunteer route, we've been able to get access to some extraordinary people who otherwise we could not afford to hire. These people were primarily motivated by their desire to help. They were motivated by some personal connection to the communities that were displaced. A lot of them cared about the experience that they were building through this, the ability to kind of flex some of their skills developed in their professional careers to do good.
Yeah.
And so they cared a lot. A lot of these people were working very, like busy, demanding jobs. And despite that, they were doing this for like many hours a week. In some cases, in times of like live deployments, it basically became a second full-time job, right? Yeah. People were working easy 40 hours, 50 hours a week on this after doing the 40 hours, 50 hours a week on their job. And so we were very fortunate and we're very grateful to that team of people who've come together to make Nostos possible. But that was another reality of running a volunteer-run nonprofit, because then money was not a lever to incentivize people. Like we had to truly find out what motivates them. We had to truly find out what they care about, and really, really sort of dig and dive on that element and use that to provide value. Incentive alignment worked very differently. Like unlike a startup, it's not like, oh, you have options. If you do well, everybody does well. We didn't have that sort of situation, right? So It really had to be about intrinsic motivation. It really had to be about experiences, wanting to grow, wanting to learn through this process, and so on. And that led to its own set of challenges in terms of managing, in terms of organizing. Because everybody was a volunteer, you had to be very realistic and reasonable about expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like we couldn't go and ask people to, like work as much as you would for like an early stage startup.
Right.
But people still did on their own. But like it was very interesting in terms of how we had to balance some of those competing pressures.
Yeah, yeah. And so what's this is super interesting. One thing which kind of keeps coming to me is like you're talking about all the other volunteers, but you yourself were on a job which was pretty demanding. How did you manage, right? Like because well, now you have to write so much code and like all of that stuff, and then this happening. So yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, it was hard. In fact, at the time of our Malawi deployment, I was PM at Google, and I was running a sort of startup inside Google,
Yeah,
and that was a lot. That was intense. We were in the process of launching a product. Um, there were some very long days, and at the same time, we had situations where we also had a crisis on the Nostos side. And so when all of that came together, I think what truly made things possible was leaning on the team, particularly my co-founder at Nostos, Kaushal, the team. We were very, very fortunate to have this extraordinary group of individuals really caring and
yeah,
putting in the time and effort. And so we were able to sort of all find a little bit of balance, juggle things. But in some cases, it was just, you just have to do
yeah,
what you have to do. In some
yeah,
cases, it was like other things had to, like give, right?
yeah.
So there were times where I was like, okay, I'm not going to see another human being for like this week, but we will get this done. There were some days where I like slept in the office just because there wasn't enough time to do everything and like go back and so on. So a lot of it was a juggling act, but also a lot of it was just leaning on incredible people on both sides and
Mm,
incredible sources of support that made this possible.
yeah. Okay, so I've got a few rapid fires for you, Madhav. Okay.
All right. Yes.
So if you could do this all over again, what would you change drastically?
The way that we built our team. I feel like
Hmm.
early on we focused on a lot of things that were not very important, and we should
Yeah,
have very single-minded, very sort of blinders on, focused on just building and like iterating on the operations process because that took a lot longer than it should have.
got it. Okay. So in the next 3 to 5 years, what are you personally most excited about?
We're exploring mechanisms to make this less operationally heavy and
Mm,
more scalable. And
yeah,
I'm very excited about that. We're playing with a lot of ideas. And some of these involve more partnership oriented things. Some of these involve things around manufacturing capabilities, around local logistics, and so on. So there's a lot of directions. But
hmm,
the ultimate goal is how can we make this scale better?
got it. Okay. Last rapid fire for me. This thing requires a massive intrinsic motivation. What is your source of intrinsic motivation?
Interacting with this is deeply fulfilling for me. Like the time that we spent, I was both Kaushal and I, with other people from our team, all of us went to
Yeah,
Malawi in person. We've been to every deployment site so far in person, and it is incredibly fulfilling to see that this idea is now real. It's a house on the ground. There are people living in it. It has fundamentally changed the way they live. It has hopefully given them, this opportunity to rebuild, and that is, for me, such an important feeling. It is a way for us to sort of give back on a cause that we care very deeply about, um, using the skill set and experiences that we've built.
right. Just to follow up on that, like there are times and days, which I'm sure you've seen many as well. Things just don't go right, right? Like
Yeah.
everything just goes awry for one reason or the other.
Mm.
How do you pick yourself back up?
I think a very big part of it does come down to that motivation. A very big part of it
Yeah.
comes down to the person in those homes, right? It comes to the fact that there are people who are living in these houses, who we've talked to and who depend on us, and there are many people like them. And so we always go back to that. We always go back to some of those stories. We always go back to the people that we've met, and we remind ourselves that what we're doing matters. This is important. It's worth doing, and so we kind of suck it up and get back to it.
No, but I mean, you guys are definitely doing such an incredible job. So, Madhav, that is all my questions in rapid fire. The very last one, just if you were to give advice to somebody who's interested in the nonprofit space, or it's just like building a nonprofit, right?
Mhm.
What is it that you would tell them?
Start sooner rather than later. Like a lot of people in the nonprofit space care about, building the perfect product or building the perfect business,
Yeah,
or finding like multiple years of runway in terms of fundraising and so on. And sure, those things help, but get something out there, put something on the ground. That leads to a virtuous cycle. That leads, if people can see impact, people are more inclined to support impact, and that leads to this sort of self-fulfilling, self-supporting cycle of scaling. So put something out there as soon as you can.
got it. Okay. That is all that I had to ask you, Madhav. I am very, very happy to have had this conversation. And of course, having known you, I'm just very excited about seeing the future of Nostos and where this goes. Thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thank you, Shreyas. Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Okay, great. So, everybody, that was Madhav. Madhav is the co founder for Nostos Homes, and I am just so very impressed with him and the team for building this thing and ultimately saving so many communities and so many houses and bringing them back to a livelihood. So, until next time, please stay tuned, continue watching, and thank you so much.